As many of you know, the Contemporary Talk Series is an attempt by the Contemporary Art Center to bring in significant, consequential practitioners in a variety of fields, and to bring them in at a time when it's timely, when they're doing something particularly of note, when their practice is particularly being looked at, maybe by others in the field. And so it's very much with that in mind that we want to welcome Michelle Grabner, who is an artist, a writer, a curator, an organizer of exhibitions, and is having a particular moment, I would say, as one of the three curators of this current Whitney Biennial. So we want to talk about a variety of things today, and forgive me if I'm not swinging this way this evening. I'm Stuart Grabner, for those of you who don't know. We want to welcome you. This is the last day of our current exhibitions as well, with Fallen Fruit and Stephen Anderson. So if you have not seen them at the end of our session today, please take a chance to do that. I'll tell you a little bit about Michelle if you are not up on her varied practice. She, amongst the other things that I've said, as a very active multitasker, she's the professor of painting and drawing at the School of the Art Institute in Chicago. Along with her husband, Brad Killam, she founded the Suburban, which, for those of you who often think that a small endeavor in a non-central location, not in a big city, is not worth doing, this will prove you wrong. The Suburban is a now over 10 years? 15-year endeavor in the small masonry structure that's in the back of Michelle and Brad's home in Oak Park. And she has worked with countless artists. We'll look at some of that by invitation. Artists coming to do things that they probably would not get as much freedom to do in a very modest space. And it's an amazing testimony to what you can do with generosity and precision. We'll get into that a little bit. For artists in the room who may feel like they live in a state of constant poor farmness, she also started something called the Poor Farm, which is a not-for-profit space in Northeastern Wisconsin. Writing that she's done, which is extensive, has appeared in Artforum, Modern Painters, Frieze, and Art Press. We have in our shop examples of the great book called The Studio Reader that she developed with Mary Jane Jacob, and which was published by the University of Chicago Press. So we want to dive into a lot of things, but we really just want to welcome you, and thanks for being here.
Thank you, Stuart. It's great to be here.
So I want to talk about, my notes are in a particular order, and I have a feeling that the slides are in another order.
Exactly.
But let's talk about the idea of being a studio practitioner. And I want to quote something to you that you said, which I thought was
Always dangerous.
terrific.
Quoted. Reading back my word.
I would imagine that this is a sentiment that comes along with being in the studio. With painting, I could go to the studio, be by myself, and change time.
Yes.
So I want you to maybe talk a little bit about, we have some images of people working in studios. What does it mean to go to a place that is a studio, to be alone, and make things, and in effect, change time?
Right. And I'll give you a two-part answer to that. And can everybody hear me okay, or do I need to bring this up a little bit? A little bit better? Yeah, okay. So I'll give you a two-part answer. So the relationship that I have to painting and redundancy and repetition, you know, as Stuart said, the slides behind us are in a different kind of order. So I'm going to really kind of go ahead and move these all the way through some of the suburban work into my work. And I think Stuart's question will be illuminated by looking at my practice a little bit. Thanks for your patience. All right, so these are some examples of early work, 90s work. So the idea of being in the studio and the protraction of time, right? I mean, just think about what happens and how we consume time and information, right? It kind of directs us. So the idea of being able to go in the studio in a very traditional way and to make work and to deal with something I like to think about as situational boredom, right? I mean, we live in a time and a culture where there's no time to be bored. If we feel bored, we're likely to go to a shrink and be medicated. I mean, we just do not understand the idea of having time alone, to have this kind of protracted time, and to be able to use a vocabulary in the studio, a painting vocabulary, a drawing vocabulary, that deals with repetition, points again and again and again. One gets to play with the elastic quality of time, which we really don't, we're told how to use time in kind of a day-to-day experience. So there's something important there, but the other answer to that question, the idea of being in the studio, is I need to be in the studio by myself to deal with these issues, whether it's boredom, whether it's a kind of focused repetition, or kind of paying attention, that's balanced out with all these other activities which are extraordinarily social, right? So whether it's curating, one is always talking to artists, even when one is writing reviews for Artforum on a regular basis, writing may be a solitary activity, but one has to step into the art world, look at work, determine and have conversations, what one is going to write about. Running the Suburban, running the poor farm, teaching, I have 3 kids. Like, one is always interacting with bodies, with people, with different psychologies, with different needs. So to be into the studio balances that, because I'm a simple mind in front of you. I mean, I need a little bit of both. So the painting, the repetition, the vocabulary plays out in perfect balance to the other activities which are very social.
You're reminding me about a quote. It's a quote by Philip Guston quoting John Cage, and I'm going to paraphrase it, but he basically says, when you're in your studio, everybody's there with you. Art history, your friends, your mentors, everybody, and if it goes well, they all progressively leave, and then eventually you leave. And so what I want to ask you about is a little bit about your training, people who may have been mentors or people who factor into either the evolution of your ideas about art making or the evolution of the idea about what the studio is.
Yeah, and I think one again, it's about attention. One has to pay attention really regularly to everybody who crosses your path, right? So an example would be in graduate school. I was at Northwestern because I could not get in as a graduate student to the School of the Art Institute, where I now teach as a full professor, but I applied for 2 years and I wasn't able to get in. I just wasn't good enough. So I went to Northwestern, but Ed Paschke was there, and Ed Paschke is a Chicago imagist, and prior to coming to grad school, I was interested in imagery, particularly found imagery. And while I was there, I was working with Ed, but then also visiting artists through those programs, and Julia Fish, longtime Chicago painter, an abstract painter, did studio visits, and she came in and she was looking at my work, and it's one of those things where you knew what she was saying didn't make any sense, and she kept going to one part of the painting, and I was making images of women in popular culture, Laura Petrie. All right, so Julia comes into the studio. I'm making these images that deal with women in popular culture. So I was really looking at feminism, its relationship to entertainment. And Julia kept going to a part of the painting that had a little pattern in the background. She said, just do this. And I'm thinking, oh, this is a bad studio visit. It's time for you to leave. She doesn't get what I'm doing. And 3 years later, I'm in the studio, out of school, and it all came tumbling back. It made sense. And, it was a 3-year lag time. But that happens consistently. So, don't be hasty when people are giving you feedback. It may not be the thing you're thinking about at any given time, but the walls may come down at another point, and that may be another door that you go through. And Stuart, in terms of history, I'm still learning now from my graduate students. Teaching, it goes both ways. You hear this all the time, it's a little cliche, but and by the fact that one is a teacher, it's really important that one is always mapping and looking at the world. So it is. It goes back. Is this on? Testing. Is this better? Can people hear me? Okay.
All right. So maybe it would be interesting, given that setup, Julia's comment and your eventual movement into using patterns, be they crochet patterns, or tablecloth patterns or things that in one way or another might be constituted as a kind of representational abstraction. I mean, these are things that were grounded in the real world. They have sources in daily life, but they also are pattern-centric, shape-centric, repetition-centric.
Right, no, that's right. And just so you know that those the paintings, the round paintings, the canvas are actually round. So it's a little distorted, the images are a little distorted. So be patient with them. But yes, to Stuart's question, when I came out of graduate school, you know, the things that I was thinking about in school were appropriately academic. I mean, these were things that I was getting when I was, you know, reading theory and dealing with 20th century studies. But when one steps out of school, one is in a different context, and it's important for one to not overreach. I mean, there are amazing artists right now, and I'm including some of them in the Biennial, that are research-based artists that really kind of delve into a kind of study and then create artifact around this research. But for me, as a young mother coming out of school, you know, it was really about order. It wasn't so much about the domestic signifiers of a blanket. It was really about creating order in which one could have a fully invested studio practice and being a diligent mom and, you know, the part-time teaching that one needed to do to kind of continue it. So, yeah, I don't ever shy away from pragmatics. I mean, I'm one of those people where, you know, the limitations that are posed to me, I welcome them because I find more freedom as the, you know, as the contours close in.
One of the things that you just said reminds me of conversations that I've had with many women artists over the years about repetition and being able to leave regular life and going back into the studio to deal with something that you could just pick up on. So if it's a grid-based work or it's something that one could leave, it's not a kind of, I'm making this image and this activity in a one-shot relationship. It's kind of talked about under the umbrella of piecemeal work. So in relationship to the idea of you working with time, time is something you could enter into and move towards and come back to.
Yes, that's right. You know, just in terms of studio practice, I think it's always interesting to ask artists what the relationship is to the everyday, their studio practice and relationship to the everyday. And you know, I'm old, so getting up at 4:30 in the morning and working until I get the kids to school at 7:30. You know, that's my regular stepping into the studio. And then maybe I get back to the studio, or maybe I go into school, or maybe I'm on a plane to Atlanta or to New York. So trying to get that kind of consistency on a regular basis, but it's not predictable. Again, you know, as Stuart was saying, you know, when one wears many hats, one has to have a flexible relationship to the studio. That doesn't mean if one is not having a daily studio practice that's regulated from, you know, 8 to 5, one isn't a serious artist. One just has to understand that, and this is how I tell students, you know, the job is a reality. It's some, you know, getting a paycheck for a lot of us, you know, finding insurance, I mean, these kind of things. Don't think of that as, you know, that weakens the practice. You just have to work with it.
So I want to shift for a second to move away from studio making to another comment that you made, which was, I never had ambitions to be a writer or a curator. I only had my sights on painting. And so I'm interested in, given what you've said about being in the studio, juggling the range of things that you've been juggling, how you found yourself. And we've invited over the last several years to Atlanta artists, including David Humphrey and Mira Shore, any number of folks who are also simultaneously writers, practitioning, makers, occasionally curators, certainly teachers. So how did you, having said you had no intention to steer into those realms, enter into them and then find them satisfactory, so much so to keep juggling all of them?
Yeah, sure. Right, again, we have to go way back. When I stepped out of graduate school in Chicago, my husband also went to a better graduate school than Northwestern, that was University of Illinois at Chicago. He was there with Tom Friedman and Arturo Herrera. It was a particularly interesting program at the time, and it still is. And then I was at Northwestern, and we got out of school, we had a young family, and Chicago was expensive. It was difficult to navigate. So we moved to Milwaukee, and Milwaukee is a culturally flat city. There was, you know, not a lot there. The American Museum has a fine collection, particularly particularly in German Expressionism, but there was no criticism, there was no curating from the ground floor, and we wanted to continue the discourse we had when we were in grad school. So we were creating exhibitions in Milwaukee where we could bring up, Arturo Herrera's work and introduce it to. All right, we're going to do this. Okay, but we'll get there. Okay. The other thing I want to tell you about a slight technical glitch, and maybe Stuart can help me. I'm not able to advance the slides. Well, I don't know what I'm supposed to do.
All right, we're at the point where we're going to now move into shadow puppets.
Yes. There you go, got it. We're just in my work, that's fine. So I'll talk a little bit about taking on these other activities where when I was in school, I didn't anticipate that. Actually, when I was in school, the strategy was to be a teacher and to get a teaching job. That is, as we know, very difficult. So I have a master's in art history as well. And again, thinking about, well, if I have a master's in art history and I have an MFA in studio practice, maybe some small liberal arts school will hire me to teach both art appreciation or beginning art history survey, and I can teach drawing. I mean, I was really, I knew that, I needed to find a paycheck, I had a family to support, I needed insurance. So these things were really clear to me early on, and I have a 21-year-old now who, doesn't think ahead. I keep telling him, think ahead, you can start working towards some of those things at this early age. So Milwaukee required that we do these things. We curate. I started writing for Frieze when I was in Milwaukee. I was the Midwestern correspondent for years. I wrote for Frieze, and writing is difficult for me. But what I learned and why I keep curating when I get asked to do these things, or when I ask, do regular writing, which is difficult for me. What's important about that, and I think it's important for all artists, and all of these activities help one understand the context in which you're working. So if I'm showing you this repetitive, pattern-based work, you still have to watch very, very carefully what's going on, what other practices are, what's coming up through museums and institutions, what is moving through the commercial system at any given time. And by writing and curating, you get really close to these ideas. You understand the bigger context, those other forces in the world that are putting these artists forward at any given time. So they do have a function. All these things, it's not because they didn't exist in Milwaukee, and they do exist in Chicago a little bit, and they exist here a little bit, but it's almost part of the studio practice. Keep locating yourself carefully, and then these are mechanisms, whether it's writing or curating, are just really tangible mechanisms of giving back to a community, but also it gives back to your understanding of where your work is. Why does it have influence now? Why does that influence go away if you don't start making shifts? So it really is about mapping and keeping tabs of a farther, bigger distance.
So how does an idea or a question about regionalism factor into that? One of the things that comes up a lot in what I would call the Southern context, or I'm often asked to, in a crazy way, as an ex-New Yorker, speak to being in the South now and issues of regionalism. And I often wonder about whether regional perspectives do exist. If they do exist, how do they exist? And the degree to which, when we're looking at an image behind us of one of your works, in a sense, contextualized with a work by Wendy White and Mary Heilman. Yeah. And so this idea about understanding where you're working, understanding what is going on outside of your studio, and then potentially tracking the bigger picture beyond that, is a constant state of moving inward to be making the work, moving outward, as you're just saying, to be aware of things that are connected. So can you talk a little bit about what regional ideas may factor into that?
Yeah, no, Stuart, that's very profound and insightful, and I think that's actually the answer. When one moves, into the work, when one is in the studio or thinking about concepts as abstract as time, but then can pull back to, it's not globalism, but to a great distance and see things from out here. And one is, again, required to do that as a teacher, somebody who has to organize a Whitney Biennial of American art and ask what that is. So by able to kind of pull back, it actually dissolves the idea of regionalism. I mean, it shouldn't be there. As I approached the biennial and traveled about, I was just in San Francisco a couple weeks ago. In San Francisco, it's at the edge of the world. I mean, it still talks about, it hangs on to its histories, and that's its handicap. But its handicap is also its relationship to the tech industry. So there's all kinds of, everywhere you are, it has, the locale is conditioned by not just what's going on in the cultural world, but in the economic world, and geographic location. So all those things are realities, but if you're able to pull back far enough and able to go in far enough, those things don't, they're crutches. Don't hang on to those things.
No, I agree. A conversation we had at a panel discussion last year, we organized a discussion around the idea of criticism. And one of the things that came up in this discussion was within a local situation, like Atlanta, we were speaking obviously of this city, we had critics in the room, we had a range of artists in the room, dealers, and we were having this conversation about what can you actually say? Because can you be in a context where we see each other all the time, we want to be nice, there is potentially a kind of Southern generosity of let's not trash each other in writing, whether it's in print or in blogs. And I want to ask you about something that when I read it, and I read it in Artforum, and I wasn't expecting to read it, it was a review of yours of a show at Kavi Gupta Gallery in Chicago by an artist, Tony Tassett. Tony's an artist that I know quite well. I've shown his work, I've written about his work, and I know you have as well, and you're a friend of his. So for people who wanted to reimagine this idea about what can you say in a local context about someone you know, you discuss his show, saying some excellent things about early work in the 90s, his masterful use of materials to transform materials from one state to another. And at the back of that review, you start speaking about his public art. And so the quote is, concurrent with the gallery survey, Tassett installed 2 newly realized public art commissions at Chicago's Loop. Transitioning over the years from sculptural practice with a critical base to fabricating what can unfortunately only be called middle-brow pastiche, Tassett has evinced a desire to embrace a populist position, a mission that has led to a string of ambitious, albeit ultimately empty public works. You go on to say, Tassett no longer invests in a practice that is critical, resistant, and self-reflexive. Exploiting the cultural codes of spectacle is not nearly as challenging as questioning them, a task that Tassett has proved himself capable of pursuing with admirable dexterity. And there are pieces in this canon of Tony's public work that I would totally agree with that statement that you made. And I find it something that I just had to ask you about because of you wrote it, you knew it was going to be there, you knew he would read it, and he's currently in the Whitney Biennial.
Right, I included one of his big public works in the Whitney Biennial, which you will all be able to see. It's
so talk your way through
Riverside
that.
Park. Yeah. Right, it's a very different piece. I can explain that a little bit if that's something we want to go into. But how do I get into that? Sure, I got some blowback from Tony and from people who support Tony's public work. But any kind of good criticism. I mean, this is the thing. We don't have a canon. We don't have theories that we can overlay in contemporary production anymore. I mean, there's, in academia, there's something called new materiality or affect theory that we can kind of pull forward. I mean, they're fashionable. They kind of come and go, and I like to use them because they're a frame in which one can evaluate work. But with Tony, somebody who I've been invested in his work for a very long time. Tony is and was a professor at UIC, where he was my husband's teacher for a long time. So, even though he's just a handful of years older than I am, generationally, he's very influential in terms of how I think about contemporary work. And, I've been following him and wrestling with it for a long time. So setting up this frame, championing some of the old work, tells you a lot about me if you read that article, where I think work should be powerful. It shouldn't just succumb to a popular bit of amusement on State Street, a kind of awe position. Those are glorious things, we all like them. But in relationship to some of the harder things he was doing, what does that mean? How can somebody who has who's dedicated many years of his life what unifies these things, these kind of very popular, large-scale elements to, again, some of these kind of very kind of critical, self-reflexive works. And quite honestly, what in Tony's work, it's a kind of relationship to ego, a need to have an audience, a relationship to a myth of the artist that is pretty interesting. As a guy, a dude artist, but for all kinds of reasons. And it's that psychology that is most interesting to me, and and that's real to Tony. But if it can do something else, like again, have a critical platform, have us look at the whole mechanism of art, as some of those early works do, ideas of consumption, bring that forward and challenge some of this other work. I'm not saying that I'm right in that assessment, and again, we have to, in the world we live in, we have to be prepared to rethink that, and thus, I'm not backpedaling by including Tony, a monumental piece by Tony in the Biennial. This is a particularly different piece because it includes everybody who's an artist in this room is likely to have their name on this piece. It's 400,000 artists that are listed on Art Index. I mean, it's just the inclusive, it just represents everybody. So that is interesting to me in terms of the idea of the Biennial, which we can get into it. It's just not a fair process, right? In terms of who's in and who's not. You can't think that curators act fairly to have a fair look at practice in America. But Tony's project acknowledges that and includes, at least recognizes through engraved names, 400,000 artists working in the U.S. right now.
Yeah, and I bring it up by virtue of not wanting to. Tony has a long career that has, like most careers, which get past a few years, cycles. You can't name a band you like, you can't name an author you like, you can't name a filmmaker that you like, where you just unabashedly love everything they do. I mean, that would be miraculous. I think the challenge is to have a very high batting average of thoughtful, excellent work over many years. But the question of critical response is a question of what are we allowed to say, even about artists of significance. A thinker, let's call Saul Ostrov a thinker, curator, organizer, he's in the Biennial as well. And I remember many years ago, Saul telling me that he was trying to peddle an article about the Richard Serra retrospective that was happening at MoMA. And his framework was why there are no Richard Serras in the Richard Serra show at MoMA. Because the MoMA show had sort of categorically left out some of the most messy, scattered, rubber, experimental works in favor of, I think everyone agrees, the rather masterful torqued ellipses. And Saul felt that, in a sense, that was a misrepresentation of Serra. It was hard to argue against the dominant support for those big works. And everybody thinks those big works are amazing, so how could you not focus on them? But it was a question, he said, and not a single person was willing to sort of publish this. And so what's interesting to me is this question of what we are allowed to say and how often either we are self-editing or other entities are editing us. So maybe a question for you is, as you tried to write about art over the years, how much tinkering with what you wrote or how much dialogue with editors have you had about trying to adjudicate what's going to come out in print? Because certainly that review stunned me in the fact that it was one of the few critical things I read about an artist in a very long time.
Magazines, they're for-profit entities, right? They have to sell things, and they sell things by ads. So if there's a lot of critical pushback from a gallery, that gallery will not take out a full page ad. I mean, you have to understand that art magazines are in bed with money, many of them, not all of them. Frieze magazine, I was writing for maybe 7 years, and then in 2003, 2004, they decided to have a no negative review policy, just categorically. That's changed because the editorship has changed. So different venues have, different kinds of understanding. Artforum is a complicated place to write. I mean, they basically, almost rewrite every sentence. I mean, it's a back and forth, it's an editing process. And as a result, they're flawless in terms of copy editing. But they also have ideas, and it was interesting because I've written I've sent them harsher texts before, and they neutralize them, and this one they were okay with, the Tony Tassett one. So, you know, it's this kind of back and forth that one has to have. But you know, it's, you have to understand that, you know, what happens in this studio, or when one has a relationship to an idea, you know, there's truth in that. But as it moves through the world, in words, in exhibition, fiction starts flowing in. I mean, the whole thing becomes, you know, pliable and interesting, and the sooner you can let go of the fact, and find out where the value is, and if the value in my work is in the studio, it's in the process of situational form, the repetition of vocabulary, you know, once these works leave the studio, once other people talk about them, once even what's coming out of my mouth now, based on a condition of being here, you know, these things are, you know, they can't at all represent the kind of the truth of what's happening in the studio. So one should be able to play with that, but also be emboldened to, you know, lay down a kind of criticality with it. You know, it's only respectful to the artist, to the work, to the practice, to the bigger thing, right, to the bigger idea.
I want to see if we can get back to, I think it's going to be going backwards now, to the Suburban,
Yeah.
and talk a little bit about your impetus for starting the Suburban, and now, you know, a decade plus into it, this is a nice little textual shift back as we're finding this. The question of, you know, why you started it, how it was structured in your mind, how it may have changed over time, what the joys or challenges of doing it are.
Sure. So, you know, Suburban, I told you after graduate school we moved to Milwaukee for a handful of years where I was teaching part-time. I was teaching at a prep school where my boys could get tuition remission and a good education because the public schools are crappy in Milwaukee. So, like, all of these, you know, all these decisions are life decisions one has to make for, you know, the good and so forth. And, you know, this is where we started curating, started writing. Then we were able to move back to Chicago in 1997. Now a long time ago, and bringing some of those, the kind of, you know, startup ideas that we, you know, enacted in Milwaukee and bring them to Chicago. If we never left Chicago out of grad school, I don't think I would be up here as anything besides a painter, because there were those other mechanisms in place in Chicago. There was New York Examiner and other things. But because, you know, we moved to Milwaukee and had this building that was attached to this garage that we had. It was a body shop attached to this house in Oak Park, which is a first-ring suburb. And, you know, it's all by 10 by 10 feet. And, you know, we still were young and ideal and decided that we had kids. Why shouldn't we bring the art world to us in Oak Park instead of, you know, we can't travel as much and so forth. So, yeah, in 1999, we started having exhibitions, you know, and if you go back, there are some examples of Tony Fair. Luke Toymans was out for an opening and then asked to do a project. This is a rebuild of the Suburban in my survey show at MoCA Cleveland right now. So this show, I mean, this is where it makes me uncomfortable. This thing, because it's such a kind of perfect little architecture near sculpture, has been rebuilt so many times it's almost a franchise. I can tell you how many cinder blocks it takes to build this structure. This is a Tony Fair piece, you know, for November. He gets back from Manifesta in Istanbul. He was influenced by the Islamic pattern, and, you know, with blue painter's tape, went out and kind of taped the window. It looks really easy as Tony's work does, but it's complicated. He spent, you know, it took him, you know, he'd tape it up, peel it off, you know. And so for a week in November, now a handful of years ago, this is an example. And I think there's more, Stuart. Backward. Yeah, these are hard to see because of the light. So anyways, you know, various projects. The current project is really confusing to us. And did you see the car, the crash? This is Katharina Grossa. So Katharina Grossa is a German artist, you know, and it's she's working with 2 graduate students at the time. So, you know, it really is a space for artists. This is Danelle Wolford again. Danelle's interesting and complicated, and I hope to talk to you about her. I'm including Danelle in the 2014 Biennial. Danelle doesn't exist. She's an invention by the artist Joe Scanlon, who is a great artist in his own right, and also runs the department at Princeton. And it's riddled with all kinds of problems. She's a black woman artist, invented by a white male guy. So it has all kinds of problems inherent in it. But Danelle is, I find her interesting, and she actually exposes some of the problems in institutions about representation. Here's Waleed Beshti, who is a well-known Los Angeles-based artist who had a show with Jim Welling. So we have actually 2 exhibition spaces. I encourage you all to come to visit us. I want to tell you that if you come visit us right now, there's a big old white Buick that ran through the face of the Suburban. A local artist decided to drive a car into this little structure. So it will have to be rebuilt yet again. Yeah, that's some complicated psychology there. This is a project, often artists, when they're invited, they want to engage the house where we live as opposed to the proper exhibition spaces. And this is an artist in Chicago who, when she was in grad school, she was in sculpture at the Art Institute, and as Kelly knows, it's expensive to go to the Art Institute. You pay a heavy fee in tuition. So this young artist decided to steal toilet paper from the School of the Art Institute while she was there for 2 years. And though I never worked with her, she called me up after she graduated and wanted to know if she could toilet paper the house with all the toilet paper she stole. So she drove a U-Haul truck with some friends. And I came to know her work, and it's where pranks become very aestheticized. And it was a beautiful thing. She dissolved the architecture of our little foursquare in Oak Park.
So talk about how you may come to invite people and what the terms of the relationship are. Obviously the car backing into it is maybe an extreme version of what's allowed, but just from the standpoint of how you're picking, what sort of set of rules might be in play, what some of the economies of that might be, if you're willing to mention that.
Yeah, no, it's very simple. It's not a not-for-profit. We don't sell work. On occasion, people will call and say, "Hey, is that Tony Fair, David Reed, is that available?" And we will just direct that person who's interested in perhaps purchasing to either the artist or the artist's commercial dealer. So that's one thing we don't want to do. So it's just built within the household economy. I mean, both my husband and I are privileged to have full-time teaching jobs, so we can set this stage, this platform for artists. I don't curate these things, nor does my husband. I mean, it's a matter of scheduling. One has to understand that, when one is doing a project in Suburban, the space is small, you stay with us in the house, we have kids, we have a dog running around, that it's not a typical institution. It's in the suburbs, which is, it's great. Frank Lloyd Wright examples are all about. So it's not a terrible place to come and visit, but it is very different. Sometime in the spring, I just start the schedule. I meet people when I'm in Atlanta, when I'm in San Francisco, who have been out there, who maybe get out there. You just have to be there at some point. And then, it's surprising how we don't get proposals. We don't get proposals that often. There's not a particular style. I mean, you can just go through, over 200 artists. They're across the board. So it's close to home, and I try not to think too much about it. I let the artist kind of move it forward. I try to keep a very light hand in how it goes forward.
And how does that differ from the endeavor of the Poor Farm?
Right, the Poor Farm. And Stuart, to show these guys what the Poor Farm is, I think it's after, go forward. So the Poor Farm is an institution, and there's Poor Farms all over Georgia, all over the U.S., including Canada, and it's the rural equivalent to the poorhouse, which was built in cities for the most part. It is a social institution that it is challenging. A social institution that came to a head in 1850. One could not be without means. One could not be kind of wandering the land without resources. And if one was in the 1850s, one could be sold off in a kind of slavery situation. Somebody could, a landowner could absorb you. So it has a close relationship to some of the underpinnings of slavery. So the Poor Farm and poorhouse system was seen as a very progressive system where one was an inmate. So you were assigned to a poor farm, you were an inmate. So this is, and they were county run. So this is Waupaca County. There's a jail in the basement. There's a graveyard in the back. In this case, you worked 97 acres. It was not a good life. It was mostly first European immigrants, males. There was a couple women who stayed there to run the kitchen for the most part. So yes, we bought this in 2008, and it's now a kind of Kunsthalle. It was a successful Poor Farm, unfortunately, and there's a building in the back. where we use it as a kind of residency, but it's not a formal residency. If somebody has a good idea, if somebody wants to take their graduate seminar in sculpture to spend a week in March there, they can do that as well. So yes, this has been, and we have exhibitions. It's basically the suburban to rural cousin. We have an exhibition that lasts the full course of the year. It always opens in August, and then it will come down in June of the following year, and then we rotate again. It has a summer school. You come and join us, and there's a summer school that is a blend of universities from the Twin Cities, Madison, Milwaukee, Chicago, teachers involved. So it's also a kind of social place, but it also has a proper exhibition space.
So I want to shift to, I think it would be obvious, maybe, that the nature of your work as an exhibiting artist, the nature of what you've done with the Suburban as a 200 plus programs and projects, the Poor Farm, that range of activity over the range of time that you've done these things might have caught the attention of people thinking about this year's biennial. So I want to ask you how it came to be that you were selected to be one of the co-curators, what some of the expectations were as you began that process with Stuart Comer and Anthony Elms, where you find yourself now that the show is sort of a couple of months away from opening. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that experience, the Whitney experience.
Yeah, and how I've come to be in this position. As I come to know it, I will lay out for you, and then guide me along, Stuart. As I start biting off this question. What happened is, in August 2012, I received an email from Jay Saunders. So Jay Saunders and Elizabeth Sussman were responsible for the 2012 Whitney Biennial. And that was a remarkable biennial because it featured performance. It featured a lot of, it featured studio as well, artists in space. But what was particularly, who's saying this? It's the rain, folks. All right. Again, this is the good stuff. This Whitney Biennial is the good stuff. So there was a concerted effort in 2000. Again. Hello. Maybe I'll talk really loud. If I project really loud, is that okay? Yes. Okay. All right. So what I challenge you all to do is to look at the last 10 years of the biennial. Biennials every other year, and you'll understand what's going on in terms of curating, right? There were a couple biennials in which, the kind of international suave curator came to the fore, whether that's Felice Byrne or Francesco Bonami. So you can really map, by looking at the biennial, what's going on in relationship to curating, and how curating is taking a very heavy hold in defining the contemporary art landscape. So you can actually map that by looking at the biennial. The biennial gets a lot of flack because it depends, because of the budget, its relationship to New York, really depends on the commercial underpinnings of some of the galleries. Artists who are represented by galleries, those galleries will put forward framing, shipping, and so forth. So for the 2014, the idea was to select 3 curators who were not from New York. Kind of remarkable. And a matter of fact, Stuart Comer, a colleague of mine, was at the Tate Modern when he was brought on board, and is now chief curator of performance at MoMA. So the center still holds, right? And we understand how culturally built New York is. So Stuart is there. So their conceit about having 3 curators who are not from New York, didn't play out from the exhibition. So that was their way of thinking about representation. This goes back to Stuart's question about regionalism before, that here we bring artists from Anthony Elms, who is in Philadelphia. I'm based in Chicago, and again, Stuart was based in London, but now in New York. So that's kind of how it came to be. This goes back to the very, very early question or comment that Stuart made about, Michelle Grabner's moment. What's important to know that I didn't set out to make this moment, right? I set out to do the busy work that you're seeing behind us. And what happens is New York can pay attention. In 2012 at the Poor Farm, we did a survey exhibition of a deceased artist who was very well known in the 80s named Gretchen Bender. And from an off-center position, from Northeastern Wisconsin, one can see the blind spots in the culturally almost overbuilt center of New York. The show that we curated went to the kitchen, which is a very prominent New York performance space, right after it came down from the poor farm. I'm hugely proud of that we can build exhibitions off-site that actually go back to the center. And then the entire collection that we ended up doing the research, tracking this work down, is now being absorbed into the Metropolitan. It's an amazing thing. So distance from the center, it gives you advantage. It's that thing about kind of pulling back. So the center is very savvy. It keeps looking at itself, and I'm now speaking about the Whitney. And it's able to identify this crazy Michelle Grabner who's sitting in Chicago, who's doing these other things, almost neglecting New York. Just not caring, being able to deal with other ideas, but not have to cowtail to the center. And then the center wants that. Bring it on. So that's I think that's why I'm sitting up here now and working on the biennial. But keep following up through.
Right. I'm going to brave handing this to you.
Okay.
Stephen Anderson, you're here, right? Your whole show is energy strategies. Will you please, just concentrate that this is going to work?
All right, much better. It's the rain. Okay.
So I think the question, and I have been aware for many years, having been in New York and talked with curators who curated the biennial and artists who were repeatedly visited for the biennial, that it is a very challenging process. It is subject to things that you were saying. It's often a very hush-hush process. There's often a lot of mystery shrouding it, and there's a lot of pressure on it. And the nature of the Whitney seems to be, for the many years that I've followed it, that the current Whitney Biennial often makes you love the previous one that you hated. The catalog from the last biennial pretty much did a fait accompli about that and reprinted, for those of you who may know this, or if you don't know it, it's worth checking out. The past biennial catalog printed all of the harsh and horrible criticism of the previous biennials in it, and almost did a sort of, everybody hates this, there's no way around it, so we're just going to show you how it's been loathed and apologize in advance. You were telling me a little bit about the nature of the development of the catalog, the nature of conversations between the artists for the catalog, a sort of notion of your own indexing. And maybe you could talk a little bit about that idea of rendering visible how many people you visited and all of the sort of things that almost nobody ever tells anyone.
Sure. So, upon being invited to take on this project, I have had 2 studio visits by previous biennial curators, and there is a shroud of mystery around it. I knew Deborah Singer was curating the biennial, and so when she asked if she could do a studio visit, she was in Chicago, I kind of assumed, but the Whitney Biennial, the name never even came up. There was never kind of follow-up after she'd been to the studio. The same thing when Val Cassell, who is now in Houston, was curating the biennial. So, and you don't know if you're in it, you're not, you don't get any kind of feedback. You know that the following fall, the list is about to come up, and if they didn't reach out to you, you're probably not in it, but you still hold on to hopes that something will happen. So I thought that upon taking on this project, I was going to be very transparent. I was going to contact Stuart and say I would like to do a studio visit in research for the Whitney Biennial. I followed up with him, letting him know that he wasn't going to be included in the biennial, but I do these other projects, and hopefully, I could work with him down the line. And and that's, that all seems to us, reasonable. But curators, when I asked about, why doesn't this happen? Why aren't they forthcoming, particularly Whitney Biennial curators, forthcoming with artists? And the response was, they don't want to hurt artists' feelings. Like they don't want to disappoint them. And my response as an artist is like, we're disappointed all the time. We're always being told no to. And it's actually very respectful to keep artists in the know, to let them know how the process is. So my whole arc of organizing the biennial is to keep that informed for, to be as transparent as possible, to be here speaking to you and answer the questions that you have in terms of how this process is going forward. Because there's 3 curators, the catalog will be divided into 3 sections, and my section has infographics, so you'll be able to see a little map of the United States. You'll see where I traveled, where I did studio visits. You'll see the relationship to gender, how many men I visited versus how many women. They wouldn't do diversity. That was a problem for them. They weren't going to break down the diversity of artists, ethnic diversity. That was something that the museum said they wouldn't do. How many people I've worked with before, how many were former students, the average age of the artist. So infographics, you'll be able to see, I did the bean counting for you, and then you can go on to make the assessment of choice in the work. That's what I wanted, and I talked about that in my essay as well. And then instead of inviting theorists, historians, and critics to kind of give a frame or a shape to something I was thinking about, I basically asked every artist that I invited to be in conversation, to speak with somebody else, and we would print those conversations. So I have artists who are talking to designers, to entertainers, to sports figures, to other artists, to literary figures. The tone is very different. Sometimes there's 2 artists who are on the show who are talking to each other. So I'm hugely proud of that. I mean, I think, just as a collection of how artists are thinking about their ideas, the tone of their exchange and so forth is really great. So I'm letting the artists speak for themselves. I'm not interested in kind of scooping in somebody to give a critical overview. I did that in my essay. I was obliged to do that. But for the most part, I think it's more important to hear what the artists have to say.
Do you have the microphone, the handheld one? Who has it? Okay, Stacey. I could do this all day. I would love to do this all day. But I think invariably we have a great turnout, and I know just looking at the room that there are people who I'm sure have questions. And so hopefully that will be a non-loud and not pronouncements, but questions for Michelle. So if there are questions, we can start to make way. Hang on a second, coming your way.
This won't be an essay or anything, it'll be brief. I was thrilled that you started out with mentioning boredom, which is something I'm actually pretty interested in right now. So I'd like to kind of prompt you to say a little bit more about studio time and boredom, because it seems like a lot of practice is about processing your own response to boredom. In particular, I mean, there are 2 kinds of responses to being bored. One is a kind of repetition until you become absorbed in the activity, which is a way of transcending boredom and compressing the way that time stretches in it. And the other is in these contemporary practices like provisional painting that are mostly about processing boredom by reverting to a kind of impatience. Right? So that's, if you could say something on that, that would be terrific.
Yeah, I'm going to actually bring it back to the Whitney Biennial. I included David Foster Wallace in the Biennial. That was my choice. I have some of his notebooks, and I've been getting a lot of people are puzzled by that. But it is because of his interest in boredom or the shift, right? In terms of if one thinks about infinite jest and the idea of distraction, that we're constantly seeking distraction, and the idea that it's the notebooks from the Pale King that I'm including, where one is thinking about the human condition of being bored. It's a very important place. There's a handful of books. This is where I know, and one person's boredom is another person's meditation is another person. I mean, I get challenged on that a lot, but I like to use boredom because I think it has negative connotations. Again, as a culture, that words that we want to run away from that word. There should be no reason why we are bored, but it is. We accept it in our 8-year-old, but as adults we don't. And I think David Foster Wallace has built. Has talked about, kind of built literature around this condition. And I like, Foster Wallace is so interesting because he will embrace cliches, and because cliches are based in truths. And then again, we're a culture that wants to be, unique in all kinds of ways, and we avoid these kind of generalizations. But, I take them head on, whether it's in my painting, the idea of a gingham motif, which is, somewhat prolific and a cliche in and of itself, to, ideas of how one is, philosophically, and how one engages in the studio. So yeah, and I want to say that I saw another book called, it's not about boredom, but it's how to not do anything. It was talking about overproduction, that we're in a position of, autodidactic production all the time, always busy all the time. And so there's a parallel with that. I haven't, I have to go to Amazon and press order now for that text, but yeah, so that's something that is very interesting. And as a result, there's a little bit of a Marxist underpinning. When one is bored, one is not consuming, right? And this is, you feel capital's pressure to, it's capital that's telling us not to be bored, because we're in a different space and time of our own.
Hang on a sec, Carol.
Well, I think my question will follow up great to that, which is, what are you reading right now?
Yeah, I wish I could say I actually thought about what am I going to bring with me on this trip, and I brought knitting. I'm knitting scarves for my actually curatorial assistants at Biennial. It's funny, I did so much reading in preparation for my essay and for the catalog development that I kind of don't know where I'm going to jump in now. I mean, it's such a big research project, and there was so much that interests me, and again, I have stacks and stacks of books. I have George Saunders. I was going to throw that in there. I'm one of those people, I can tell you, as I'm feeling like I'm terribly backpedaling, but there's in Moose and an Extra magazine, there's some interviews that I recently did, and I can't even read those once they're in print. I can't even go back. I would never do them again. I mean, it's one of these things where I can't, once it's published, there's nothing one can do about it, so I avoid it so I can kind of keep kind of charging on. So I'm not reading anything right now.
Would you mind me asking, what was the last book you did read? The last one you put down there?
This is moving into Sarah Palin territory, I feel, very quickly.
Yeah, I've been reading a lot of poetry, particularly Mary Oliver, and Elizabeth Bishop. There's a catalog. Elizabeth Bishop, who's also a poet, made these beautiful, exquisite drawings, and there was a catalog, an exhibition catalog that I just finished reading last week on Elizabeth Bishop's work. But that was an essay. That was the most recent thing, outside of just consuming the blogs in the newspaper.
Thank you.
I hope you don't mind, I'm going to kind of put you on the spot.
No, of course.
I am not an artist, so I feel like I can ask this question, but I know that you, or I know none of the curators from the current Whitney Biennial came through Atlanta. And I know also that there are a lot of really great artists here. Can you, now that you've had this experience, give us, Atlanta, some advice about perhaps how we can get involved in that process and be considered for the next go-round?
Yeah. I went to Savannah. Came close. Yeah, this is interesting. I'm going to tell you something I told Stuart yesterday about Chicago. So, there's inevitably 2012 Biennial, there was one person from Chicago, I believe, and then 2010, both Julia Fish, who I mentioned earlier, and Jim Lutz were included, right? So Chicago, has these people. And, at the announcement of the curators a year ago by the Biennial, I was contacted by some very powerful curators in Chicago. Let's say they're housed at the MCA and the Art Institute. And they said to me, this is hugely exciting for Chicago. Now you can, you can foreground practice. You will be the champion for Chicago. And in my head, I was saying, F you, because it's their responsibility to build Chicago artists into the big programs, the big institutions in Chicago, and they don't, right? They're reaching elsewhere. The MCA is always cosmopolitan and global, and they'll throw the token local artist in here and there. But for them to put that weight on me to be able to bring Chicago artists to an international stage was something that they could be working on for their tenure at their institutions, and they neglect doing that. However, when the list was announced, because Anthony Elms, who's now in Philadelphia, was in Chicago for a long period of time, he put forward a lot of Chicago artists, and I put forward a good, so there was critical mass. I mean, I think there's, I'm guessing right now, but about 15, 17, 13 artists from Chicago in the Biennial, right? So there's, people are writing about that. Chicago is finally represented. It's not, and represented fully. And as a result, there's curators in town who are finally getting their ass out of their seats and getting into studios because their colleagues in New York are going to say, yeah, Chicago's interesting, what's going on? And they can't say anything because they're not there. So it takes, so all of this, it took really something substantial. In the past, like I said, for years, there's always been a Chicago artist, one or two, but you don't hear that. It's just about the overarching representation of, practice in the United States. That's what the biennial is supposed to represent. But it hit this point in Chicago where, it actually is activating curators to have to know what's going on in their own backyard because everybody else in the nation is going to find out what's going on in Chicago. So that's a good thing. So, but to your question, the answer is, and this may seem cynical, but it's to get somebody from Atlanta as a curator to the biennial. That's what it's going to take. And again, artist curator from Chicago, nobody really saw that coming. But again, when I was answering Stuart's question about when he was kind of probing me on regionalism, which is, I don't even acknowledge that, what we're going to see is, and this is, again, I'm going back to the free market economy, right? A lot of us were in Miami last week. The free market economy is going to look for inventory, and New York's not going to be able to saturate that market. So they're going to have to go elsewhere. My graduate students at the Art Institute, my graduate students at Yale, they're making decisions to come to Atlanta, to go to Vermont, because they have a former friend who has a print shop. Like, people are making lifestyle decisions to incubate a career, not for themselves in New York, in the center right now. There's interesting things going on in New York, I'm not denying that, but it's not a place where a young artist needs to engage. They need to watch it very carefully, almost on a daily basis. But they can go elsewhere to deal with, to think about, to nurture their practices. So, yeah, I know that Stuart and Anthony didn't make it here either, but as professional curators, they went about the whole process very differently than I did. I mean, I went into a lot more studios than they did. They like a proposal process. If they were interested in Atlanta-based artists, they may not have went to Kelly's studio, but they could have rung Kelly up, now a painter in Atlanta, and said, give me a proposal, I'm doing the biennial, what would you do? So that happens more regularly. So right now, the changing state of curating is such that just because Atlanta or Nashville didn't get a visit by a Whitney curator, that the Whitney curator didn't make it, to that city, let alone into a studio, that conversations weren't had. So that's something that you have to watch. Whether they're in, the final measure is whether they're included in the biennial or not.
So is it also, kind of going back to something that you said earlier about encountering the work elsewhere. So if an Atlanta artist, if the curators aren't coming here, it's also very important for the artists here to have their work seen in other places so that a curator may bump into it. Is that also true?
Yeah. There's a reality to the market that's really shaping discourse in contemporary art, and that reality, it's the market stalls, which are the art fairs. And what I tell artists in Chicago, we don't have a great commercial underpinning in Chicago. That's not probably equivalent to Atlanta based on population and art schools and so forth. But if you can get the attention of a commercial gallery that actually goes to the art fairs, that's where everybody goes, right? So that, whether it's shopping or whether it's looking. I talk to curators at the Whitney. They love going to the art fairs because it makes it easy for them to, it's all gathered in one place. So there's convenience to that. That seems so like this is the same.
It's also, I would say, I think just from my own point on this, and I've lived in cities that had visits Portland was a place that I lived when Larry Rinder came through and met with oodles of people, wound up selecting one or two. I know other cities that folks were visited and didn't get in. There's just too much pressure put on the city part. It's not that the Chicago artists are representing Chicago. They're representing themselves. If you happen to find an artist who's in Cleveland or in Atlanta or in Boise, they're not going to save the city. You know, if they would have plucked a Detroit artist and put them into the biennial, it wasn't going to counterbalance bankruptcy. You know, it's nice to think that it's equitable. It's nice to think that all of the folks in these positions of power have done a sort of democratic overview, but it's impossible. And I think to your point, one of the things that is, and I think you know this very well, Rebecca, as a writer and as a curator and as a person who's out and about, that any number of people that I can see from my little perch here, that everybody in the room is doing some version of trying to get their work made, get it made in an ambitious and thoughtful way, get somebody to see it, get several somebodies to advocate for it, get people in the front row and in the back row to buy it and write about it. And if there's enough bubble up of energy around it, it may catch somebody's attention whether they visited the city or not. But it's very hard also to politic for that. Like, I don't know Michelle that well, but I will tell you the last thing I would do would get on the phone and start politicking for Atlanta artists. It's not a smart thing to do professionally. She doesn't want to hear that. I don't want to risk my relationship with her by doing it, and I hate it when people do it with me. So that's part of the other balance of how these things are relationship-centric.
Yeah, and I want to say, you know, something. This is something else I was talking to Stuart yesterday in your extraordinary Atlanta traffic. We were great time to talk. Is that you know, the criteria, like, to some degree, the question you're asking has, you know, it's the right question. It's also the flawed question, and that means the biennial is meaningful, and it is. It has been for a long time. But there's biennials popping up everywhere now, right? At this point in the world, I can't tell you how many biennials are going on. And the reason why it could be the wrong question is that if one is in Atlanta or Chicago or Milwaukee or Cleveland, if one is there with the same, holding on to the same criteria of how one succeeds in New York City, you're screwed, right? There's not those underpinnings there. So this is what I tell my grad students, and many of them, you know, upon graduating, you know, I give them a high five and send them to LaGuardia, because when they get off of the plane in LaGuardia, they get a script of how to succeed as an artist, right? And that script says, you know, try to hook up with a commercial gallery, try to get the attention of curators, try to get some critical press. It's really simple. These criteria are there. If you take those same kind of hierarchies and bring them to Atlanta, bring them to Milwaukee, you will be inevitably disappointed on a continuum. In Chicago, we have no, you know, our critical underpinning in Chicago is really weak right now. New Art Examiner is gone. You have art papers at least. Amazing. You know, we have, you know, New City, a weekly. So, you know, so if you stay in Chicago, if my grad students, they come out, they want to hang out in Chicago, they're going to give Chicago 5 years, 3 years, you know, they have to do the extra hard work of not only being in the studio and giving language and context to what they're doing, but they have to give language and context to how they succeed and what those criteria for success are, which have to be very different than in Bushwick or Williamsburg, right? Or even in LA. So that's the extra work one has to do, and you know, and those criteria have to change all the time, right? You have to wake up the next day and kind of refigure those things. So that's extra work to be off-center, but those off-center places also give you freedoms. You know, cheap space, from the pragmatics to being here, you know, big exhibitions or big studio spaces that, you know, one can afford, you can afford to live here. You know, discourse, intimacies with people and conversations that you wouldn't be able to have in New York. So it's a different kind of work one has to do, but it's, you know, don't hold on to those criteria, and don't even, you know, the sooner you know, stop worrying about being in the biennial, the sooner the curators will in the future, who are organizing the biennial, will probably come and find you, because you're doing something else and you're really invested in something else that's structured.
We have one more question up front here. Two.
Yeah. Okay. You mentioned that that when you had a studio visit early on in your career, and somebody came in and said that they noticed a part on your canvas where they responded to it and you didn't initially, and later on you came back to it. And as somebody who's had lots of studio visits and trying to get a feel for that process, like how that works, and I've noticed that, and sorry, I'm a really bad speaker in front of people, but there's kind of like a quasi-mystical, with the contemporary artists in their studio, like a quasi-mystical approach to studio visits, and they're so prolific, and it seems like that's how people kind of get their bearings, and it's like I wonder if you could talk about the kind of like predestination that contemporary artists almost feel about a certain quality in their work that they might later latch onto and find success with, or find that it somehow expresses a part of their experience that is truer to themselves, or whether that's just being successful. And I think that links to also just how many groups and genres of artists, like Chicago Imagists, they kind of resist that, and how personal their work is and how figurative. And I just read lots of interviews with Chicago artists that kind of resisted that predestination, where somebody might seek kind of this global kind of community of practice of forms that somebody might tell you, well, that looks like something that could work. I wonder if you could talk about that, because you've done so many studio visits and you've had so many as well. I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it's really different now. In terms of the Imagists, they were getting some attention in the day, but Chicago, like Atlanta, I can talk about the contemporary set in Chicago, like what we think about Chicago now. Like Chicago, from a center point of view, gets a soundbite. They get what is going on in Chicago right now. We would say it's the black male artist, kind of spearheaded through Theaster Gates, right? Kerry James Marshall's been there for a while, but that is defining. And I can live with that. That's not a truthful soundbite. There's a lot of interesting artists there, but that's the frame Chicago gets from the international world right now, and that's cool. I mean, it hasn't been that for a while. It was the Images for a really long time. So the idea of Chicago being a black metropolis, and that there's artists that are representing that, that's it's a problem that we get a soundbite, but that's it. I can live with that. The Images, and this is what also is interesting. This goes back to, again, the free market in terms of this thing that's the economy in the art world. Whether it's Carl Worsum or Jim Knott or Ed Paschke posthumously being included in a Whitney Biennial. Phil Hansen I included, who was affiliated with the Images, is included in this biennial. They're getting their play now, and they're either dead or they're very old in their career. So you can't anticipate when the context is right, and the context right now being the free market, looking for inventory, looking for artists who haven't are maybe in history but haven't kind of been played out.
Can I just respond?
Yeah.
But the predestination, though, the kind of like that a form is meant to be, like a lot of contemporary artists. I had an argument with a colleague. He said that someone came in his studio and told him just to do what everybody else says to do. And it's that kind of people telling you that's okay. I wonder if that's a thing that you see as prevalent or not. Not really. It depends on the individual.
It depends. I mean, when I go into graduate studios, I will tell my graduate students, like, what's working and why, and what's not working and why, right? But when I was doing studio visits for the biennial, I wasn't in there for critical assessment. I was asking what's going on.
Okay.
You tell me what's going on. And that was awkward for me because I'm a teacher. I go into lots and lots of studios and I have this back and forth and I'm making critical assessments and judgments. But the biennial required me to kind of hold my tongue in a way where, where are you from? What's going on? Why are you doing this? Why is this framed? Would you think about this? But it's always a question based, so that's very different. And the idea of, you got to get really comfortable. I mean, if you go to undergraduate or grad school, you're getting feedback all the time. I know Stuart gives feedback here to people who want to come in and talk to him, but that's not the real world. You got to get really comfortable with your thinking, and you have to kind of go out and solicit any kind of feedback. Get your friends in the studio. You can invite curators to the studio. It's a Mr. Toad's Wild Ride. I mean, curators aren't trained. I mean, it's a curatorial curation. It's a curatorial industry right now. You can go to curatorial programs. They're all over the world. It's a money-making endeavor. They're not they're taught to be, independent thinkers. They're using our work to illustrate their ideas. We're in a very different place. I mean, many curators just don't know how to be in studios. They don't know how to ask questions. They're very uncomfortable. That's not their space. That's the space of artists. Marjorie Perloff. She's in the Studio Reader. She has 2 essays about studio visits. I recommend that you read the studio. Yes, yeah, she's fantastic. She publishes 2 pieces. So they really kind of give you the guideline in terms of what to expect. Which is nothing. Don't expect anything.
All right, I think don't expect anything would be an interesting line to end this discussion on. Hopefully you had expectations when you came here and they were met, as opposed to what I just said. I would encourage you to internalize some of what Michelle said, to read some of the texts that she's written, to follow the range of activities that she consistently performs. Because I think in a way, the answers to the most prescient questions are sort of answered not by her talking, but by what she does. And so this idea about making things and organizing works and projects in a very generous way with artists that interest her, by inviting people to come and participate in the sort of resources that she possesses, is a really good model. It's a model, it's a generosity model, it's not a top-down model. It's a sort of a cross and up model. And I think it's a more progressive and more sustainable one. So I would just say that that's the end of my advice. We want to thank you all for coming. I want to certainly thank Michelle for being here. And we'll see you all at the Whitney.
Thank you.